What's the stupidest reason you've been fired? I once got fired for being too damn good looking, or so my mama told me, but I doubt any of us have a story as good as my guest today, who after working the same job for 10 years, got fired for being colorblind. Felice Ciccone will be joining me today and helping me tell you the story of when he took the company to court. When I first read Felice's story as I was preparing for my last video on disability, it just boiled my goddamn blood so hot that I knew I had to make a video on it. You see, in Canada, colorblindness is considered a disability and therefore a protected class. So how did he get fired? Felice, start at the beginning.
All right, so hey, I'm Felice Ciccone from Thunder Bay, Ontario. I'm colorblind and I was a screener at the airport for 10 years.
When he worked at the Thunder Bay Airport, Felice's immediate employer was a private security contractor, Garda, who handles operations but must follow the tight regulations imposed by CATSA, the federal authority and the Canadian equivalent of the TSA. CATSA makes the rules, Garda enforces the rules. Rules including that screening officers meet a medical requirement that includes having normal color vision. Felice started working in 2003 after originally passing his medical with a practical color naming color vision test. What color's this, what color's that, etc. Every 2 years, he would be recertified in his role, which would include taking a clinical test, either the Ishihara or D15, a test that he failed every time, but for 10 years, this was always ignored by management. In fact, his colorblindness was anything but a secret.
I wore it like a badge of honor. I'm colorblind. Exactly. I could do this job better than all you guys. Yeah. Oh, Felice is good because he's colorblind. Oh, he doesn't need to use the function keys because he's colorblind. It was just a running joke, you know?
Despite his colorblindness, over the next 10 years, Felice became one of the most senior screening officers, a team lead, an elected union steward, and highly effective on the screening equipment. As part of his role as union steward, in 2013, Felice brought up some grievances concerning unsafe work.
And I was asked to train on this machine, the full body scan. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. It uses a millimeter wave radiation there to kind of see through your clothes and stuff.
Full body scanners are the modern replacement for walk-through metal detectors where you stand still, lift your arms, and get scanned. There are two types of full body scanners: backscatter X-ray scanners, which are in the process of being phased out due to the small dose of ionizing radiation they expose you to, and millimeter wave scanners, which were used by the Thunder Bay Airport and are now recognized as the safer technology.
I did my research and there wasn't too many negatives because, like you said, ionizing radiation is one thing. The only problems you can get from the millimeter wave scanner were heat. So if there was too much power putting through the machine, you might get like a microwave kind of effect where your eyeballs might heat up. And that was very rare in the 2 seconds of exposure you had.
So Felice recognized that it was accepted as safe to scan passengers. When the machine was new, calibration consisted of the screener walking through once at the beginning of the shift. Then, at several times throughout the day, they would use a dummy to make sure it was still working.
It was a piece of wood with a little sign that had a letter A behind a piece of carpet. So it wasn't a person. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, now you can run through.
The problem is the output of the millimeter wave scanner was a 3D image of your naked body. And it turns out people don't like their privies to be eye groped. So with great public backlash around the end of Felice's tenure, the human interpretation of the images gave way to automated target recognition. ATR does not display the actual raw body scan, but uses AI to figure out if the passengers got any suspicious objects on them, then informs the screening officer where they ought to pat the passenger down. The ATR didn't work well with the dummy they already had, so CATS decreed to just use a live body to check the calibration of the machine throughout the day.
We would kind of put like a uniform on kind of thing, right? That would have threats in different areas. And then the machine would be able to detect if there was a threat or not. And I wasn't okay with that. So I told them, I'm not going to run through this machine 30 times a day, myself, when we can just use an object instead of having to use ourselves.
So now Felice has outed himself as a shit disturber. The reaction of upper management of Garda was to audit his medical records despite him not being due for recertification.
A few days later, it came across someone's desk that I was colorblind, which the airport had known for the entire time I was working there.
I wanted to see just how colorblind Felice was, so I had him take a test with me.
All right, so I see an 8, 7, 3, nothing, 6, 5, nothing, 6.
This is so weird when I can see them and you can't, and I
have
to prevent myself from taking the mouse there.
3. Ooh, I'm going to guess on this one because I can't. I'm going to say 5, but I don't know.
It's all about guessing.
7, 1.
if you say so.
Yeah. Nothing. 3. Nothing. Nothing. That's a 2. A 4, maybe?
All right, let's see. Yeah, I hate to tell you,
Oh, God.
you're colorblind. You're a Dutan. Sorry to
All
break the
right.
news, man.
Yeah,
This is must be a really rough way to find out
it is.
that this might affect your career in the future. So Felice is a moderate Dutan. While moderate Dutans can sometimes sneak a pass from other tests like the D15 or the Farnsworth Lantern test, they will almost certainly fail the Ishihara every time, as Felice did repeatedly. Upon finding the failed color vision tests, Garda offered him accommodation, and I don't mean a free apartment. Let's talk about the law. Had Felice been working in the US or UK, they would have likely just terminated his ass, since being colorblind does not qualify as a disability and is therefore not protected. However, in Canada, colorblindness indeed explicitly counts as a disability. This means that a company cannot deny employment based on colorblindness if reasonable accommodations can be made without putting undue hardship on the employer. In other words, could Garda make changes to the role that would not affect Felice's pay, wouldn't cost them much money, and wouldn't pose a safety hazard? Do you consider colorblindness to be a disability?
That's a loaded question. Depends on really what field you're going to be in, you know. So there are some fields that are for sure is going to be a disability. Like if you worked at a paint store selecting paint colors or matching paint colors without a computer there or whatever, right? It's going to be a major disability. Whereas the airport, it wasn't a disability for me. As a matter of fact, it was probably a benefit. It helped me see things that other people couldn't see. I would say really it all depends on the career or what you're doing, because it could very well be a disability. Absolutely.
So when we call it a disability, there could be some cases where it's an advantage. In a lot of cases, it's a disadvantage. And it's hard to label something as a disability kind of carte blanche. Everyone knows that colorblind people may have some advantage when it comes to spotting camouflaged objects, that the pattern recognition kind of overcompensates for the lack of color vision. And that might play a factor in why you may be a better screener than the average color normal person. How do you feel that the American TSA could have just canned your ass for being colorblind and left you absolutely no recourse?
It definitely would have sucked, because I mean, I don't know if I would have gotten as far as I did in the U.S. system in the TSA as I did with CATSA.
And then you wouldn't have been able to complain to your union or enter arbitration or have a YouTube video made about
For
you.
sure, yeah.
We don't want to label colorblindness as a disability a lot of the time, but I think we can agree that it makes sense that it's protected in situations like this, and
Right.
that people shouldn't just be able to push you out of a role because you're colorblind without even thinking about whether they need to or should.
Right.
So what accommodation did they offer Felice?
The accommodation was just basically to remove me from any position that I would have to need, like I would need color to do my job in their eyes. So we're talking like everything. They basically put me down to be the guy who checks boarding passes, a greeter. So I would just take a boarding pass, check it, and then let the person go on, put their stuff through the X-ray.
And before this accommodation, how often were you doing the boarding pass check?
Very, very rarely. That position is usually for newer staff members or people who are just going through their normal rotation. But when there's a newer staff member, that's where you would put them to kind of get a feel of how things are going, because they can't really screw that up. So it's basically like a position where they just put me where I couldn't make trouble for them, basically.
So, checking boarding passes was the only role left for Felice, but what roles did they bar him from?
We'll start the CTX machine. So that's basically a machine that runs out of the public eye, where you check people's checked baggages. So there was that machine and the search that goes with it. And then we had the oversized X-ray, which was another X-ray device that was for people's oversized luggage that couldn't go through that CTX machine. So that would go through there. That was a completely separate position in a completely separate location. And then we can go upstairs. There was the full body scan that we were discussing earlier. There was the normal X-ray that we would put people's bags through when we see them. Bag search was another one, and I couldn't do that because you needed to reference the X-ray image. I couldn't do the walkthrough. I couldn't do pat downs. It's
like forbidding a chef from using the stove, the oven, the fridge, and thereby just relegating them to cutting onions all day. Yes, it's part of the job, but no one would want that job if that's all they were doing. The idea behind restricting Felice from all of these roles is that each role interfaced with scanning equipment that used colors in their displays. There are 4 main pieces of scanning equipment that screening officers used at the time: the metal detector, the millimeter wave full body scanner, the dual energy X-rays for carry-on luggage or oversized baggage, and the CT explosive scanner for checked luggage. Each of these indeed used color in some way, but it certainly doesn't mean colorblind people are incapable of using them. I want to take a look now at each of these technologies, how they work, and how color is used in them. The most basic of the 4 scanners is the metal detector. Though they're now mostly being replaced by the millimeter wave scanners in North America, metal detectors were still the primary passenger screening equipment at the time. During the startup of Felice's metal detectors, a self-check would confirm the operation of the machine.
So when you turn it on, if the light goes green, it's working. If it goes red, it's not. And there were different LEDs. So one, it's not like the same LED that changes color, which is super difficult, by the way, when it comes to color blindness. It's 2 separate LEDs.
Which is like super easy because we just remember that left is good, right is bad, just like how we adapted to traffic lights by interpreting the consistent position of red, amber, and green, and not necessarily the color of the lights themselves. And this check was also only at the start of the day. When it came to operating the machine throughout the day, there was no use of color. A ring of lights around the perimeter would light up, showing the vague position of where it thought the metal would be.
The lights on the side would tell you they're not green or red. They were just, so they are red, but they're not like 2 different colors. It wouldn't have mattered what they are. Like you said, they could just be brightness. It's just like, hey, look here.
When it comes to the full body millimeter wave scanners, the raw output is a 3D model of the body. No color vision necessary. After the ATR was implemented, the screening officer would no longer see the 3D model, but rather a stick figure like this, where the ATR then highlights any area of the body that may contain a threat so that the screening officer can then pat them down manually in that specific location. The ATR system at Thunder Bay did use color, but the color only signified what kind of object the AI thought it had scanned, which was immaterial, not only because 2013 AI was terrible, but because the resulting manual pat-down protocol was the same regardless of what the AI thought. So again, just because color is present in a task or an interface does not mean the task is color critical. Even a fully colorblind person is able to operate the full body scanner just fine. As we switch over to the X-ray machines now, I'm going to be explaining the science of how these things work because it's important for really understanding the role that color plays in its operation. If you want to skip the science part of this video, here's the timestamp that you're looking for. Carry-on baggage has been scanned with X-rays since about 1974. Originally, simple transmission X-rays were used, which yielded a black and white image, fully accessible to the colorblind. They were really hard to interpret though, and have historically been described as seeing a Rorschach test. With these machines, a thin, dense object and a thick, lightweight object will look the same, so the machines are pretty much useless past seeing the obvious outline of a gun. However, after 9/11, X-ray machines got a much-needed buff with new dual energy machines which shot low energy and high energy X-rays through your bag. The average of these gives you the classic X-ray image, but the ratio of these signals gives you something pretty neat. A signal proportional to the average atomic number, or Z effective, of all the atoms it passed through, with which you can effectively tell what material an object is made of. This is super useful since most explosives are made from organic compounds, those based on carbon, and come out to a Z effective of around 7, a bit higher than the atomic number of carbon. These explosives would have never shown up on conventional X-rays, but now they're pretty obvious when placed next to aluminum with a Z effective of 13, or nylon with a Z effective of 5, paper with a Z effective of 8, or water with a Z effective of 7. And this is why airports have gotten all up in your jock about your half-empty bottle of Dasani, because to the machine, it looks like a half-full bottle of C4. Okay, yeah, so color. Screeners could look at these 2 grayscale images in isolation, the thickness one and the Z effective one, but it's actually a lot easier to combine them and represent each one with a different color dimension. Now you have an image where one dimension, the saturation, represents thickness, and another dimension, hue, represents Z effective, such that any Z effective under 10, organic stuff, is orange, any Z effective between 10 and 20, inorganic stuff like glass, is green, and any Z effective above 20 metals are blue. This is called the trimat color scheme. Like I said, just because there are colors doesn't mean there is a problem, and as a moderate deutan, these 3 colors did not pose a problem for Felice. To my severe protan eyes, the blue stands out real nice, which is good since the vast majority of actual threats are tools and knives and such, but the green and orange are identical, and it gives me flashbacks to my youth of always drawing grass as orange. That doesn't mean protan should be banned from these machines though. Ideally, software developers simply choose an accessible color scheme or make the colors user selectable. Switching the always uninteresting inorganic segment from green to gray would have made the trimat as clear to deutans and protans as it is to color normals. They didn't have that option, but they did have something almost as good. They put in filters. By pressing different function keys, the screening officers could isolate each one of these color segments on the screen, thereby neutralizing the need for color vision completely. The kicker is, most standard operating procedures of the time even mandate that every screening officer, regardless of color vision, routinely use these filters to aid their interpretation of the images. So the software and the processes are already set up to be colorblind accessible. Starting around 2010, a new technology began being adopted by airport security, CT machines. CT machines basically take the dual energy X-ray machine and put it on a spinning gantry that images a bag from all sides and performs some computer magic to generate a 3D image of the contents of your bag. The first advantage of the CT scanner is obvious. The 3D form lets screeners much more easily interpret the shape of an object, making a gun much easier to find, for example. The second advantage is less obvious. Recall how I described conventional X-rays as not being able to differentiate between a thin, dense object and a thick, light object? Now that the CT can differentiate between thick and thin, it can now also infer the density of the object. Where a standard dual energy X-ray wouldn't be able to differentiate between water and C4 or diesel fuel as they all have similar Z effectives, they have vastly different densities, and so the CT machines can tell them apart. The CT machine now gives you all sorts of quantities to encode on the screen somehow. The density, Z effective, the shading for the 3D surfaces. How do they do it all? How can one screening officer interpret all of those colors? Well, they don't. The machine uses automatic threat detection, similar AI to the full body scanner, to synthesize those properties and estimate threat or no threat. In its most basic form, it looks an unknown material's Z effective and density combination up in some lookup table and can get a pretty good idea exactly what the material is. Plus, it can automatically detect the common shape of knives, guns, etc. The automatic threat recognition does the heavy lifting, and let's be honest, colorblindness does not make you illiterate. So of all of these machines, the metal detector, the full body scanner, the dual energy X-rays for cabin baggage, and the CT scanner for checked baggage, they all kinda use color, but the use of critical color is limited. So the disadvantage of the colorblind must be slight. I mean, maybe the colorblind are a bit slower or a bit less effective at spotting things. I don't know. What do you think, Felice? How would you say that you performed compared to your colleagues?
I was amazing, like awesome. Like I would definitely say I was top of the class there when it came to screeners, and that's not just bragging. Like I said, I was really good.
I mean, it does sound like bragging. Look, I can tell you my opinion on the matter. Felice can tell you his opinion on the matter, but shit, we're colorblind. You shouldn't trust us. How can we actually know that a colorblind screening officer is not less effective than their peers?
So the best way is to actually give them a functionality test in the field of what they're going to be doing and do it several times so you can just 100% know that what they're accurate.
There are two types of color vision tests. First, there are clinical tests that will attempt to determine your general color ability. These include the very common Ishihara or D15 tests. Then there are occupational tests that attempt to replicate the actual use of color in a specific role. These include the Farnsworth lantern test, which replicates determining the color of distant boat lights, or the FAA's light gun test to ensure that you can determine the colors of, well, the light gun in a real scenario. So it doesn't matter what your general color vision is like or whether you can read the number on an Ishihara plate, as long as you can pass the occupational test. And often, the general tests are terrible at representing the practical uses of color vision for a given role. So, which do you think is better? Occupational tests are not always available, like in the fire department or military, where clinical tests are required, but where occupational tests exist, they rightfully supersede clinical tests. If you can pass an occupational test, your scores on the Ishihara or D15 just don't matter anymore, at least for that specific role. For Felice, what mattered was whether he could detect threats on the X-ray machines, and as it so happens, the scanners Felice used were already perfectly set up to allow for occupational testing, which he can tell you more about.
If you're on the X-ray, every now and then, especially later on in my career there, the AI would throw a threat in a bag. They would have no idea. It would just be a computer-generated gun in someone's bag, and they would say, oh crap, there's a gun in this bag. When they press the button, it would go away, and if it didn't go away, you know it's a real threat, time to act. But then there was, a testing machine where we would go on a break and we'd kind of run through images to kind of see if there was a threat in there. That was another testing procedure, and that would record basically how well a certain screener did and have like a log of, if this person missed things, if they didn't, blah, blah, blah. Before the machines got automated, we'd grab a bag, we'd throw a fake grenade in there and a bunch of other things, and we'd throw the bag through and see if they can catch it or not, right? So with enough of these tests, I mean, you could develop an image of if a screener is good or not. That's pretty much the only way to do it. A colorblindness test isn't going to tell you anything other than the fact of if they're colorblind or not. But if they're passing the tests where you actually put a bag through and there's a threat every single time, then you can be confident that person is going to be able to catch that threat. Hands down is the best way to make sure a screener knows what they're doing.
And how did Felice do at these tests?
I'm not trying to brag or anything like that, but I was really good at the job. I mean, it was like a detriment for them not to have me there. Like I've caught several things that other screeners had just let go through. I've passed penetration tests where basically like the government trying to sneak an explosive or something like that on a plane where like, you don't have any warning. You just have to basically adapt and stop the situation, which I did successfully. So they used to give you a pen, but I didn't get anything. So they call them pen tests, right? Like penetration tests. So I think that was like the benefit. Instead, I got fired. So, and then there was obviously the training machine, which I just flew through that. Like there was not a problem. It was like a game for me. Whereas other screeners had difficulty doing this. What other qualification or thing do they need to prove to you that they can do their job and provide safety for the public?
Yeah, we're colorblind, so our credentials don't matter at that point.
Yep.
I want to now go over some of these images and see if you still got it, to see if you really are as perfect as you claim to be.
So starting from the right of the image, and we'll move to the left, it looks like they got tennis balls. So you see 4 tennis balls. Obviously there's a gun, that's whatever. But anyways, you got a bottle of water, and you can see how there's an outline which covering a bottle, which is basically like, hey, take a look at this, because it's got a density that's kind of, it could be an explosive. So then you got your little toy gun there. That's probably not a real gun, but anyways, just keep going. Underneath that, you got a pair of high heel shoes, but to the left, you got a stereo. And then underneath it, looks like you got the adapter for it. Now, that is also something that screeners are going to want to really look hard at, because there could be something, hidden in there. It looks like there's a comb behind it, one of those like round brush combs that have the little spikes. And then you can see the wheels of the bag, the handles, all those little tiny rivets and stuff like that are all the dense parts of the bag. There's obviously clothes in there and whatever else. So, I mean, obviously you see this bag, it's a threat right away. There's a gun, boom. If there wasn't a gun though, you would still check those liquids and anything else that has that density, just to make sure that it's not an explosive density that's in there.
But can you really trust someone who flies with tennis balls and no tennis racket?
I remember there was a guy who came through and he had a bunch of shampoo. It was during the liquids thing. And 2 giant bottles of shampoo. He's traveling by himself. And I'm like, sir, you can't bring the shampoo. And he's like, well, why? I said, well, number 1, there's a liquids ban. I said, number 2, though, you're bald. And he looks at me, he's like, you're absolutely right. I don't know if it was for his wife, but this guy was bald as could be, man. Didn't have a hair on his head. So he's just like, here you go, man. It's all yours. So anyways, yeah, there's always that kind of fun stuff that happens for sure.
I mean, did you end up testing that for explosives?
If we gave them up, that was it, so that's pretty much what we did. We didn't test for explosives, but it's a very good point that we should, because I mean, then we're sitting with a bunch of explosives, at least not on the plane, but something they should have done for sure.
All right, I'm going to send you another one.
Yeah, these are really easy, eh? So what do we got here? So starting right to left for threats, we've got a pair of scissors, there's a butcher knife, there's a gun, there's a bottle of lighter fluid, a Bic lighter, looks to be a knife in there, a super suspicious bottle of water. I wonder if people can see behind the bottle of water, there's a straight razor blade. So right behind the bottle of water, you can vaguely see a straight razor blade and a shaving cream. I can't see the razor, so that would kind of be like, hey, why is this guy not bringing a razor? But whatever, there's a gun in the bag. So there's this weird thing at the bottom that I can't really tell what it is, that I would just kind of get that looked at. It looks super weird, firecrackers maybe. From my brief view, that's kind of what I see. You can see the zippers and all that stuff. So the lighter we would take away, the lighter fluid you definitely can't have, we would take away. The scissors, the butcher knife, we would take away. That other knife, it looks like it's not spring assisted. If it was, that would be illegal. So we would just take that away. The razor we would take away. Aerosol we would take away. Firecrackers we would probably take away and not call the cops. But the gun obviously is a threat, so we would definitely call the police, regardless if it was fake. It kind of looks like a toy too. But anyways, whatever. We would call the cops for that. So
is it even worth giving him back his bag at that point?
no, of course not. Yeah, that guy would. You make a judgment call, right? Like if the person has a badge or a cop, they have a bullet, it's okay. If there's a super sketchy guy who's got like a bullet and a pipe and things they can make a gun with or whatever, then obviously you're going to go into your procedures and get that guy off the plane. So the most important thing is that object recognition. Colors are super important, sure, but knowing what everything looks like, you can therefore eliminate. Like you saw me with those bags, I could tell you every single thing that's inside those bags, not just the threats. But it's a lot easier to find what the threats are when you know what all the other things are inside the bag, right? So it doesn't matter. So nowadays they make you take your laptop out of the bag. So when I started, it was like training with weights on, there was nothing taken out of the bag. So we were so good at seeing through these laptops. It was awesome. And if we couldn't see through them, we would just, get the laptop taken out and take a look. So this bag is super sketchy. We'll start at the left. Whatever that mass is, it's like either a sausage or it's an explosive. So it's super sketchy the way it is. It's got to be something that's got to be checked out no matter what. And you definitely see a lot of things in the bag, like, you know what I'm talking about, that are going to be long and rubber, but that's not one of them. If it is, it's very long. So this bag is definitely a bag you search. You definitely want to take a look at that. Get those shoes out of there. Get the laptop out of there. There's wires that are probably the laptop's charging cord, but at the same time, it could be an explosive. And one thing that I always had problems with when it came to the training at the airport is that they made it really easy, like a comical TNT that you'd see like on a Bugs Bunny cartoon. You know what I mean? You got the sticks of the TNT and the detonator that sticks out of there and the clock. And it's just like, guys, that's not what's really going to happen. This bag you sent me is what's really going to happen. If that's an explosive, that's a damn good way of hiding it, because you could have a detonator in the laptop or on that phone. You could have wires that go to it somewhere else. And it's going to be very hard for a screener to say right away that's a bomb. So it's one of those things where, you want to second guess yourself and say, let's double check this for sure, because this could be a threat. It could be nothing, but you don't know. So it's not one of those cookie cutter images like the gun or the knife or whatever it is. It's something that you definitely want to check because of how much orange there is in that bag and the fact that there's electronics that go with it and that dense object that you can't make out.
Actually, according to the owner of this bag, that was an emotional support snake. Good one.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay. So yeah, that's organic for sure. Yeah.
Oh, organic for sure. You never had any snakes come through your...
I'm surprised you can't see. I don't know if snakes have bones, but I'm surprised you can't see their skeleton in there. I had a cat go through. You could definitely see the cat bones, but yeah, you definitely couldn't make out if that was a snake at all. No. I've had a human foot go through. I mean, there's people who put
nice.
Like a little fetal baby is like an experiment, I guess they had or whatever, right? So there's been things that go through.
Fetus?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This guy had a human fetus.
God.
It was a doctor. He had human feet. But yeah, that's I would definitely never have guessed that as a snake for sure.
Let's take a look at the next one.
Ooh, this is a fun one. So now that's an animal. That's an alligator or a crocodile. Someone's gonna jump up and say crocodile. Let's look at its snout. I have no idea, guys. So whatever it is, it's that. But you don't know if it's inside of it is organs, if it's dead, or if they're trying to smuggle drugs or something like that, right? So that's something you'd kind of want to really look at, because it could very well be drugs in there or something else that they shouldn't have. So definitely it almost maybe looks like there's a detonator in there. So definitely take a swab of that. Super weird. Check it out. Then you have these weird things at the top. Now, those could be sandals or something like that, but that's super weird that they're that metallic. There have been shoes that have been like that, but anyways, that's something you definitely want to check out, because that's super, super weird. There's a bunch of clothes in the bag. They do have normal other thong sandals in the bag, some perfumes, and some feminine creams and stuff like that at the bottom. Looks like they have a razor right above that perfume bottle. So there's a very big perfume bottle at the bottom, and then in front of it there's a perfume bottle, and if you look right above it, it looks like there's a disposable razor with some of their other feminine products, that belt, some other stuff.
Yeah, it's strange to me. I look at this and I'm like, alligator, and I just stop looking at anything else. And you see this and you're like, yeah, okay, I see the obvious. Then you just continue looking for all of the other
Right,
stuff
because
that's in
well,
there.
because sometimes too, I mean, depending on how smart you are or what you're trying to do and try to get away with security, you'll put a decoy in the bag, right? So
Mhm.
like you'll put something like your knife or whatever it is, hey, everybody look at this, and kind of take your eye off of whatever else there is, right? So there's going to be a lot of that you have to kind of think ahead, what does that person kind of think? Or if I was a terrorist, how would I think? How would I try to get an explosive through? And it's more than just looking at the alligator, it's kind of more looking at the other stuff in the bag. So
I got one more for you.
all right, so this one, what we were just talking about here. So, so I don't know if anybody else can see the obvious. Let's skip the obvious for now. See if there's anything else interesting in there. Nothing that like alerts me right away. It looks like there's a cell phone. It's not an iPhone, I don't think. You can tell too after a while. You can tell the iPhones versus like Samsungs and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty cool actually because you can see the chip layouts and stuff like that. There's glasses. There's a couple pairs of glasses in the bag. There's a charger for the phone. Looks like there's a bag of something like a little poncho or something like that. Those rain ponchos or something along the lines of that. The watch that's in there. There's a key behind the watch. There's some zippers. Looks like the watch is leather, like the band. Then there's the obvious dildo.
So for this bag, then it is not something that you'd bother checking. You
Well,
just
no,
send it
no,
through.
absolutely. It's organic and it's a deep organic. So, I mean, it wouldn't hurt to put a swab on this bag just to double check because there's not too many things. Like a lot of times people just expect you to know, you know what I mean? There's something super obvious in the bag, kind of detect it. It's not like that. A lot of the times it's more search if you're not sure. So there's nothing here that looks so clear that it's a threat, but it's not something that I would have just let go. The amount of wires and stuff like that and organic, I mean, a terrorist can shape a bomb like a dildo. Why wouldn't they? And then you're going to have some screener and be like, oh, I don't want to touch that bag because there's a dildo in it. Let it go. Well, that's not what you're there for. You're there to make sure there's no threat. So if you see anything that's kind of organic or something you're not sure of or something you don't know, get it scanned. Absolutely.
Damn, that was going to be the moral of the story, that this was not a dildo. It was just a bomb pressed into the form of a dildo. But I guess that is too juvenile to sneak past you.
I guess so. Yeah, I've seen too many of them, so a little too dense,
Yeah.
So,
All right, that's all I got.
all right.
So, I mean, you pretty much nailed it, maybe even better than me, already knowing what was in them, color blindness and all, which always, of course, comes back to if you can do so well, why the hell does it matter what your color vision is?
What I'd like to know is whether Felice was just exceptionally good at object detection despite his color blindness. Like, do other colorblind screeners perform worse than average, or is there no difference? Or are the colorblind actually better at object recognition since it mostly comes down to pattern recognition, not color recognition, something the colorblind are quite good at? To answer that, we need data, which Garda has. After Garda discovered Felice's colorblindness, they audited the medical records of the rest of their screening officers and found 5 others across Canada that were certified to work despite being colorblind. Garda claims to have accommodated 2 of the 5 screening officers, which leads me to believe the other 3 were just terminated. None of those 5 sued Garda, though, which just goes to show that people do not understand their rights and corporations will just take advantage of that fact. But that's at least 6 colorblind screening officers that had been continuously tested on the X-ray performance and perhaps also penetration tested. That data would easily show whether this restriction that bars 1 in 12 men from working as a screening officer is just discrimination.
I don't know exactly their story, but I'm assuming that they passed the tests like I did, and Gardo needed to save face. There's no way they can get rid of me, stop me from being a threat, and let these people go. So they opened up their whole investigation, found out all these other people, and said, hey, now we'll deal with them because they had to.
Anyway, Felice had everything he needed to demonstrate that he was able to use the scanners. So when Garda offered him accommodation, restricting him from using any of them, he refused.
What would have happened to your job if you had accepted the accommodation that they offered you?
They would have put me on the upfront position. And from my experience, so 10 years as a screener in the union, seeing what happens, I would have stayed at that position forever. There would have never been a change.
Garda refused to allow CATSA or Felice to give input on the accommodation process and amend the form. They weren't interested in whether Ciccone could actually use the equipment and, quote, "were not interested in exploring accommodation that would allow Ciccone to use the x-rays."
I requested a functionality test. So I said, okay, Joe, I want a functionality test. No. But I said, like, I'm allowed to have one. I mean, I can do the job properly. I want a functionality test. That's not going to happen.
But Garda's stubbornness was just them committing to a false stereotype about colorblindness, which is textbook discrimination.
The proposed accommodation stated of the x-ray tasks that you cannot perform these x-ray related positions. And I can think of a few things more aggravating than an able-bodied person telling a disabled person that they cannot do something despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So let me ask you, would you have reacted differently if the form read that you may not perform these positions rather than cannot perform these positions?
That was one big thing where I was like, how can you write this? You know what I mean? Like, you're in one minute, you're like, oh, this guy's so good that we don't even need to kind of look at his results of tests. We already know he's great. And then right afterwards, turn around and say, there's no way he can perform these positions. Absolutely not. Because they were going by wording. Like, they were going by what CATSA's wording was, that a screener who doesn't have perfect vision cannot do this. So I don't know if it was more like I could not perform the positions or I was not allowed to because the legislation was saying that. But that really pissed me off because I was like, well, of course I can. You know I can. They can't say may because that gives you hope. You're not allowed hope in the Canadian government.
Do you or did you ever come to regret not signing that accommodation form?
No, never. I mean, like I said, if I had $100,000 or something like that, I would have fought it with proper lawyers and stuff like that. But what else could I do? Sign the form and then sit up front for the rest of my life? It's not going to happen, man. It would be depressing. Imagine being so skillful and all of a sudden now you're doing something like they put you there on purpose, to demoralize you. Now you're going to check boarding passes, what new screeners do when they start, the position nobody wants because you're sitting there in front of the public eye. Whereas before you had all these cool roles, like you can go sit down at CTX and for 2 hours just sit in a chair and just, kind of play a game where you're searching these bags and making sure they're okay.
Suffice to say, this is not how the accommodation process is intended to work. This is. I know, right? Governmental flowcharts make great YouTube content. The important thing to see here is that between the starting point where both parties recognize the need for accommodation and here where the specific accommodation is offered by the employer, there's a lot of review and input from the employee, which not only didn't happen in Felice's case, but was flat out refused by Garda when demanded by Felice, which to me is a clear violation of his rights. If it really was about his colorblindness, there was a better way.
Let's do some brainstorming. You claim to not need any accommodation to work the scanners, and that's probably true. But can you think of a reasonable accommodation that could have kept both you and a reasonable employer happy?
An increase in testing, that could have been something, maybe more time on the XRT and an increased supervision.
So of all of the training that is undertaken regularly, if you have that data, then all that they need to do is look at that data. They need to audit the data. So instead of, every 2 years recertifying you and auditing your medical records, well, maybe they should just have that accommodation be an audit of your logs on that XRT machine. And that is for you and for me as well, is the obvious accommodation that would be required in that position.
But Garda had their fingers in their ears. In Felice's rightful refusal to sign the initial offer of accommodation and Garda's refusal to amend it, they terminated him and he entered arbitration with the support of his union, effectively suing Garda for discrimination. You probably know I wouldn't be making this video if the arbitration worked out for Felice. He didn't get his job back and the requirement for normal color vision still stands at CATSA, and the American TSA for that matter.
So in the end, why do you think that the arbitrator did not side with you?
Well, the arbitrator played his role like he should have. So he just kind of said, I'm not dealing with the human rights issue. That's what he said. I'm going to push it aside, and I'm only dealing with the work-related issue because it's easy for him. He gets his money, and he can just sign off and not get any legal trouble because I can't come back because he didn't want to fight the human rights part, right? So he did this. He did what he had to do to keep himself safe. And it was the safest bet. He was right. I did refuse unsafe work. I mean, I was in the union. I know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And I'm a boss too now, like I had information on this kind of stuff. You're not allowed to refuse safe work. And he was right to rule the way he did on that portion of it. What pisses me off is that he completely ignored the human rights issue like it had nothing to do with it when it was the crux of it.
The arbitrator wrote a 32-page decision from which I extracted 5 main reasons for why he sided with Garda. First, by not signing the initial accommodation form, Felice showed the arbitrator that he was not willing to participate in the accommodation process. This is, of course, bullshit. It was Garda imposing their inflexible plan for accommodation on Felice without allowing his input that prevented Felice from participating in the accommodation process. He wanted to participate by discussing the accommodation, but Garda refused. So, who's not participating? Second, based on his own interpretation of color vision, the arbitrator believed Felice should be disadvantaged at the tasks. Much of this was based on a statement from Felice's own optometrist who described his color blindness as, quote, "Males with color vision defects will be poor at discriminating subtle differences in hues of the red, orange, yellow, and green region of the visual spectrum. They will make errors in many hues in the region because colors will appear to be somewhat shifted towards the red end of the spectrum." Yikes. Let's break this down. Not just males. Females with color blindness, though less common, have the exact same problems as males. Red, orange, yellow, and green are definitely not the only confusion colors, and for protans, not even the critical ones. Colors will appear to be somewhat shifted towards the red end of the spectrum? I mean, this one is nonsense. Maybe he's talking about the opsin sensitivity shifting. No colors are shifting in the spectrum. That's not how color vision works at all. But the worst of all, they will make many errors in many hues in this region. I mean, we can make errors, but it relies so heavily on the context. And in a controlled environment like software, where the colors are usually consistent, solid, salient, and saturated, we will never make a mistake. It's incredibly situational. When you have an optometrist standing in as a color vision expert just because they know how to flip the pages in an Ishihara book, courts are going to come to the wrong conclusions. This optometrist's rudimentary understanding of color blindness is what convinced the arbitrator that Felice should be unable to do his job, in spite of the direct evidence that he was able to do his job. Third, the arbitrator felt Felice was focusing too much on the scummy behavior of Garda and not enough on his own human rights, which made him seem like he had a personal vendetta. On April 12, 2013, Felice had a meeting with a Health Canada representative and his Garda supervisor over the calibration procedure for the full-body scanner that would have him entering the scanner up to 30 times a day. Less than 2 weeks later, Garda management informed Felice that they had become aware of his medical condition and they initiated the accommodation process. Coincidence or retaliation? Because remember, Felice's color blindness was not a secret.
Again, they knew I was colorblind. They had known I was colorblind for 10 years. So it's not something that they were like, oh, we just found this out. They acted like that. They acted like, oh, we just found this out. Oh, it was the supervisor that was working before. He didn't tell us. Well, there was 4 other supervisors. Every screener knew. The supervisor you're talking to knows.
Garda claimed that they had discovered it by a routine audit of documentation, an audit that had never been performed during the previous 10 years, but just happened to be held less than 2 weeks after he started to become a nuisance as a union steward. They did indeed eventually do an audit and caught those other 5 colorblind screening officers, but the timing of the audit is just too fishy. In the court documents, Garda admits to being embarrassed in the eyes of CATSA that they had been employing Felice despite everyone knowing he was colorblind. So they picked a supervisor and pegged them as the scapegoat, insisting that they had been covering up Felice's colorblindness. It just so happened that that specific supervisor had left the company for unrelated reasons a few weeks prior, which really does make them an ideal scapegoat. It's all just super suspicious, but the arbitrator simply did not care about the possibility of employer retaliation, nor how Garda management discovered Felice's CVD, in part because Felice had no hard evidence of scumminess, only an implication. The arbitrator noted that Felice bringing up the whistleblowing at all made it seem that his grievance, quote, had more to do with challenging authority than furthering a human rights claim, which, come on, is a bit silly. Like, since when does furthering a human rights claim not involve challenging authority of some kind? The fourth reason the arbitrator sided with Garda was he was obsessed with the idea of security. He quoted a bunch of terrorist attacks that he had seen on the news that had nothing to do with air travel as reasons that security in CATSA should take precedence over Felice's feelings. He literally invoked ISIS as the reason security is more important than human rights or logic.
I was so amazed. Like, ISIS? What does terrorists have to do? Anyways, he was pulling at strings.
But hey, it gets stupider. The arbitrator also claimed that, quote,
it is not a question of whether he was able to demonstrate that he could perform the X-ray functions in the past. It is a question of whether at some time in the future he may not detect a threat, which I find as a huge crock of shit. Not only is congenital CVD, what we both have, is stationary. It doesn't get worse as you age. It doesn't change day to day any more than anyone else's color vision. If you can prove your ability in real life conditions and situations, I mean, there's nothing else.
What else is there?
There's nothing else to prove.
Like,
if you can tell, you can say the exact same thing about anyone else. As long as you can tell the important colors apart on the screen, then you will consistently be able to tell them apart. You won't just make mistakes sometimes or make mistakes eventually. I mean, there's no better predictor for future performance on a task than past performance on the same exact task.
Well, the whole point of the training altogether, it's a law of averages. If you have somebody who's great, then they're going to be great all the time. If you have somebody who's batting that 70%, then there obviously are missing 30% of those things. So at some point, they could miss an object, and they do frequently. If you have someone who's never failing, then there's no issue. There's no other way to look around it, because there's not going to be a scenario where all of a sudden now the color's going to change where I can't find the object.
I could understand the arbitrator's argument for, like, firefighters, for example, where they have to perform color critical tasks in completely uncontrolled situations and environments. You can't drop someone into a fire and expect their color vision to perform the same as on a computer simulation. But in Felice's case, he proved his ability beyond a shadow of a doubt. The arbitrator was, quote,
of the view that no amount of testing of your ability would result in an absolute certainty that on each and every occasion his color vision impairment would not impact his ability to detect a threat.
Which is a textbook no true Scotsman logical fallacy that I would hope Canada's judges would not be making. In that logic, the colorblind should not be driving, should not be cooking, should not be taking care of kids, because even though we have copious evidence that these are not problems for the colorblind, one can never be quite sure. Christ, you could make the statement about anyone. For example, contrary to overwhelming evidence, how can you be sure that Melissa's bangs don't impede her vision and would not impact her ability to detect a threat? You can't be sure, but you could just apply the same logic to anything that you don't like.
And that's what it was. He didn't like it. He didn't like the scenario. He had to find a way to make it look like I was bad. And that's what was just really irked me about it. I just felt like I was being, there was too many people against me. You know what I mean? I would have liked to have some kind of representation or somebody there on my side. But this arbitrator had an idea in his head, and that's what he was going for. And I couldn't believe that he was that stubborn.
Finally, the fifth reason the arbitrator didn't side with Felice is probably one that my colorblind audience has heard plenty. That the effect of colorblindness on Felice's life, despite him just getting fired for it, was minimal, and that he should just suck it up. It's a double standard, really. Felice has to prove that the discrimination significantly affects his life for it to be worthy of protection, but Garda doesn't have to prove that his colorblindness would significantly affect his performance to fire him. Like, as soon as you exclude a protected group, you're discriminating. Say your employer mandates you aren't allowed to sit at that particular table during your lunch break because you have blonde hair. Insignificant outcome? Sure. Are blondes a protected group? No. But should you just accept that decree just 'cause? No, don't accept arbitrary restrictions placed on you by idiots, even if those idiots have passed the bar.
The arbitrator and the union, they weren't there for me like I thought they would be, and it was kind of disappointing to see that system fail.
If I were to have an end goal with my whole channel here, it's to get unjustifiable restrictions against the colorblind repealed. It happens so often that policymakers just default to the color vision requirement because it makes sense to them without them ever understanding how colorblindness works or whether the restriction actually improves performance. During the arbitration, Felice's union argued that, quote, there was no evidence to justify the blanket prohibition. Garda failed to demonstrate any rational connection between the requirements and the actual duties of a screening officer. And Garda didn't even try to defend the colorblind restrictions. They didn't have to, because they knew that no one was going to hold them accountable. Don't let people screw you just because you're colorblind. This is Chromophobe.
What I see behind you is pretty much just a rifle. And I'm like, I wonder what message this is gonna send. Where like every time I'm talking, there's literally this rifle pointing at your head. The framing is perfect.